It was now mid-March, and news had come down the chain of command that President George W. Bush had threatened Saddam Hussein with nuclear retaliation action if he used chemical or biological weapons on coalition forces. Saddam Hussein had previously used chemical weapons on several occasions, including on his own people. The international community had condemned the Halabja massacre when Saddam had used chemical weapons on the Kurdish population in 1988, killing 5,000 of his own citizens in the process. In hindsight, I do think that in the build-up to war, I was oblivious to the additional pressure that I put on my team. I was still suffering from the emotional trauma from my time in Kosovo, and I pushed my men to their physical and mental limits. My sole priority was to fulfill the Army's needs, and no consideration was ever given to the welfare or mental well-being of my men. From their perspective, this was their first operational tour. They were preparing to have chemical and biological weapons used against them, and we were already being engaged with medium-range rockets. Then there were the 2 divisions of Iraqi armour waiting for us across the border, and the vast Iraqi army that outnumbered us man for man on our mission to Basra. Not once did I ask my men how they were feeling, or if they had any concerns. My job was to lead my men into battle, to close with and engage the enemy at close quarters. It was the section commanders who would win this war, and as such, there was no time for emotions, for doubt, for weakness. Until you've experienced warfare firsthand, it is impossible to contemplate the soldier's mindset. Your fear and anxiety are gradually taken over by a numbness as you emotionally shut down to an almost dormant state of mind. Your training kicks in, and all of the death, destruction, and the darker side of warfare become just a normal daily occurrence as you enter a zombie-like state. This process is inevitable and varies in the time it takes. But personally, and for the men of 23 Charlie, this had happened on the first day of the war. I would remain in the emotionless mindset for the many years that followed, as this prevented me from acknowledging my own battlefield trauma. In the years that followed, Ski would write a letter from his prison cell to The Guardian, stating that it was this event, along with a string of others, that had initiated his own deteriorating mental health. I believed that this traumatic event was, at part, the reason why he'd been incarcerated. Yet this is something that the Ministry of Defence has always denied, as after the war they diagnosed Ski with a personality disorder rather than PTSD. He wrote, "One of the first days after we breached the border, our section went firm, while the American gunship's Cobra helicopters cleared a village. It was an awesome sight, but an hour or so after it was chaos as cars came racing out of the village. I remember one car came up to me. Immediately I knew there was something wrong, as the driver started to get out. His wife and kids had been shot to pieces and were bleeding badly. This man brought them to me to help them. All I could do was look at them in shock, knowing that we couldn't use our kit on them to help, because we only had enough for ourselves." The battlefield trauma from this early period in the war would further exacerbate Ski's deteriorating mental health. I often think about these incidents, and, although I respected the Iraqi forces, I've never felt any guilt or remorse towards those that were killed. The civilians, however, that's where my own trauma lies. And I can only suspect that this was the same for the rest of my men. Ski continues. I look back on these incidents a lot. Some of them haunt me and have ruined my life. I get bad flashbacks and nightmares. It makes everyday life very difficult for me. The mental well-being of its soldiers was not a priority, or even an afterthought. The senior commanders were the junior commanders of the mid-90s, and as such, the British Army had a detrimental philosophy towards mental health, i.e., it was ignored. Our Optelic 10 pre-deployment training would be the polar opposite to our previous tour and would be fundamentally different to what we'd experienced prior to the 2003 war. All of our training was now prioritised around the concept of de-escalation and avoiding the fight. It was made evidently clear to us that we were no longer at war with a conventional army, but with an insurgency in an asymmetrical conflict. Since the end of the Second World War, British forces had gained a vast amount of experience in counterinsurgency operations. COIN. As a result, the British Army have continuously built on their successes and failures from their COIN lessons learned from Palestine, Malaya, and Kenya. And let us not forget about the 30 years of insurgency of Northern Ireland by the IRA. Ever since General Sir Gerald Templer applied his successful hearts and minds policy in Malaysia in 1952, the principle of minimum force has been identified as a crucial component in COIN strategic planning. This policy would be effectively implemented for the British withdrawal of Basra, but was not instilled or effectively enforced by the low-level commanders at the lesser tactical level during the summer of 2007. The COB was built around the airport, and within hours of returning to Basra, we were under enemy fire. These were generally Chinese 105mm rockets, and were not very accurate. The camp was tented, but within each tent there were pens made out of breeze blocks, into which, for our protection, we were required to jump into when hearing the mortar alarm. On this such occasion, the four of us did just that. I remember sharing a nervous laugh with the other lads, as this was a lottery, and the protection on these fabric tents was minimal, to say the least. I couldn't help but think back to my previous time in Iraq, and wished that I was in my trench again, as this would offer far better protection and safety. These indirect fire, IDF attacks, would intensify throughout the Irish Guards deployment on Optelic 10. These constant IDF attacks would result in 5 deaths of British personnel at the COB, and these would be responsible for a further 127 British casualties in that same year. A counter-rocket artillery and mortar CRAM phalanx would be installed in the May, as the indirect fire intensified. But unfortunately, some would inevitably always get through. The increased attacks was a political strategy from the local insurgents known as the Mahdi Army. It had previously been agreed at the political level for British troops to withdraw from their security duties in the city area of Basra and hand over the responsibilities to Iraqi forces. As such, the Mahdi Army would politicise this to support the narrative that they had forced the British out. This would solidify their claim to the city, and one must not forget that they had already infiltrated the Iraqi security forces as well. The British Army had deployed 45,000 of its service personnel to Iraq, and now 4 years later, only 5,000 remained, the majority being in combat support roles. No foresight was given towards the British providing a long-term stabilisation force, and it was a huge mistake by coalition forces to disband the Iraqi army after the 2003 war. As a result of this very significant oversight, British and American forces would be bound to stay on as a stabilisation force, and this was something that the British Parliament had not foreseen. The insurgent groups were well aware of the dwindling support for the prolonged occupation of British troops in Iraq, and capitalised on the lack of WMDs for their own propaganda. Their rhetoric was that they had successfully forced the British out of Basra. And, from a certain point of view, this is correct. I was deeply saddened once Basra was handed over to the Mahdi army. I thought back to the scenes of jubilation when we'd entered the city in 2003, and the sacrifices that we'd all made. Then I recalled the pride that I'd felt when returning to the same streets and witnessing how vibrant they were. And now, after our withdrawal, the city would gradually become a haven for militia and criminal activity. Rival militia, insurgent factions and criminal gangs would compete for control of Basra's lucrative infrastructure and resources. This was mostly through oil and shipping, and it would appear that my 2 tours of Iraq were a complete waste of time, as we had defeated one dictator, only to hand over the control of Basra to criminal elements, all because the British people lacked the resolve to see the mission through. We had been defeated by the political will of the British people, and this, at the time, felt like a betrayal. In terms of welfare, the US, even in 2007, were years ahead of the British and understood how maintaining the morale of the troops increased battlefield efficiency. The American government has since been recording the harmful psychological effects of warfare and currently openly advertise this on their own recruiting web pages. In 2021, in the US, 17 veterans commit suicide daily. In fact, the suicide rate for veterans who have deployed is 1.5 times higher than civilians. Although this is staggering in terms of numbers, the US government has acknowledged that there is a correlation between veterans and suicide, which is a welcome start. This is an ocean apart from the Ministry of Defence, as we have to rely on a veteran support group for these numbers. And the British government still refuses to document the suicide rates of our own veterans. This raises many questions about the cause of the high rate of suicides amongst the armed forces, especially the argument for liability concerning the psychological damage from the British Army's harsh behavioural training methods, or the battlefield trauma from our operational experiences. Or maybe both.